Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the marvelous, the wonderful Mr. Bob Greaves.
Several shows, rather than having a guest, I've been talking about some of the ideas that I struggled with that contrasted me in my experience with the traditional notions that I had been clinging onto. And that by being honest, I found that I couldn't cling to some of those more traditional ideas. So in the last several shows, I've been talking about various aspects of how I understood the biblical text, how I understood the concepts of theology itself, various other notions that I had about truth and how it works, and that eventually this all kind of came together for me in a manner that caused the fabric of my faith to begin to fall apart. Not my faith itself, but its fabric. Sort of like, as human beings, we wear clothing, and the clothing certainly alters our appearance, but our clothing is not us. It's an expression of ourselves, no doubt. But in a similar sense, the way we make sense of our faith is in some ways really not our faith. It's just the way we deal with it. It's the way we make sense of it. And I found that this fabric of my faith was beginning to come apart at the seams. It just didn't fit together as neatly as I once thought that it would or that it should. Now, today I want to talk about how some of the thinking that I went through as a person, as a person who is self-aware, aware of myself, how that thinking kind of set me up for a very radical change in the way that I think. And I'm going to begin by making an odd little statement that many of you will find that you would disagree with. And I'm saying it deliberately in a way where I'm trying to provoke you to disagree with it. But it's not really as simple a statement as it may seem, for I will explain why it is true, even though on the face of it, it seems blatantly false. And so the statement I want to start out with is this: neither you nor I are ever changed by the things we experience. We're never changed by the things that we experience. This isn't to say that we don't ever change, nor is it to say that we don't change as a result of many of the things that happen. But it's not the going through the experience itself that changes us. I learned this in a way that was extremely liberating. It took me, I'd say I was 32 when I first learned it. Let me explain it a little bit more clearly, though, before, and I'm not going to give it all away yet, but let me explain it a little bit more clearly. The change that comes to us is not from what happens. The change that comes to us is rather precipitated by what we imagine what happened says about us. In light of how we understand what we think happened. So it's not what we go through that changes us. It's what we think it says about us and what it is we think we went through and how we explain what it is we went through. The story we tell ourselves that gives the narrative of our experience and the implications we find it says about us. That is what changes us. And I came to that conclusion eventually. It took me till I was 32 years of age before I could embrace that solidly. But I had noticed it from time to time prior to that. And it made me raise an eyebrow and wonder about some of the things I was thinking. But I would notice, for example, that two people could go through a very, very similar experience and yet come out the other side, one stronger, one weaker. One person could go through, say, a difficult, stern talking to and come out the other side more resolved to do better. Another person could go through a stern discussion or accountable moment and come away from that defeated. They might have both gotten exactly the same conversation. The same thing may have been said to them, the same points being made, the same attitude even being demonstrated by the person speaking. And yet both people go away from that experience with a very diametrically different experience. What explains that? How do people do that? I suppose that at first my explanation for such things as that was that, well, some people get it, some people don't. Some people are smart, some people are stupid, or whatever. But then when you see that people, no matter what their intelligence, no matter what their wisdom, seem to still nonetheless have all of these different experiences, it makes you wonder, well, what's really making the difference here? What is it? And I would notice things like this as I tried to observe human beings living. And of course, I would do that sometimes because I'm trying to figure out my own life. But it finally came to me that I realized that what changed me, what made me who I thought I was, what shaped me into the person that I was being, was not so much the experiences I had been through, but what I thought those experiences said about me and how it is I understood those experiences. Now, in some sense, I could even say that I'm kind of luckier than some people in that I didn't have a very, very happy childhood. And in a sense, the reason I say that's kind of lucky is, first of all, I'm trying to see it that way, but and I've changed the way I understand what it says about me. But I'm just kind of funning with you. The reason I say it was lucky is that it gave to me a way of thinking about myself that I embraced from it that was so incapable of working that it had to end. It had to come to an end. It had to shift into another direction. Whereas I think that a lot of people are less fortunate in that they might have some very, very destructive ideas about themselves that kind of keep them from making the kind of progress in their life that they would like to see, or the kind of development that would be healthy. But because what they do think about themselves makes life workable, or at least apparently manageable, they can continue on to the day they die in directions that are just not really good for them or the people around them. But I was in such a manner that as even a young man, there was no way that I could continue thinking the way I did about myself, about others, about life, about my experience, without this somehow really having to radically change. And so eventually it came to the bottom of the barrel, and you hit the brick wall for the last time, and you decide something has got to make sense in a different way. And this experience, the personal experience of my own life, put me in the context of this Christianity and this attempt to make sense of the traditions and the doctrines and the roles and the responsibilities and the definitions, all from in the context of this human experience where my life is just, in some sense, a personal misery, and where Christianity was not becoming any kind of deliverance from that misery for me, even though I had hoped it would. Now, let me give you a little bit of the background of how that worked for me personally, and it'd be different for different people. This is my story, I suppose. I was raised in a home where I experienced it as tremendous emotional abandonment and ceaseless and severe criticism. As I understand it, I had a mother who herself was somebody who was trying to not hate men, wanted to love her son, but was perhaps very disappointed that he was probably going to grow up to become, one of them. And so this created a very kind of double bind sort of relationship that I had with my mother, where she was in some ways wanting to be a good mother, but in other ways regretting what it was inevitable. And there was a sense in which it gave her hope when I was in pain, when I was psychologically distraught, when I was behaving in a manner that indicated I would be a failure as a man. This seemed to almost give her hope that maybe I wouldn't turn into one. And the sense is that with my mom, I actually got more attention from her, more sympathy, more of that closeness that everybody needs closeness of some sort. And as a child, I got more closeness when I was failing, which in some ways becomes, you don't realize it at the time, a real incentive to fail, and a real incentive to give up when things are hard, particularly if things really are hard. And life can be hard, even for a kid. Anyhow, that was the way that I experienced it. Who knows what was really going on there? I may never know. Sounds like my dogs are welcoming someone home. They're awesome little dogs, but they're barking down there. Anyway, that was my experience of my mom, and it didn't occur to me, I'd say, until I was, really in about 21, that was kind of what was going on. It was hard for me to understand the entire thing, and what have you. If you could hold on just a sec. I'm going to see if I can get these dogs under control. Sorry, yeah, I had to. My daughter's going to help take care of the dogs. I think someone's at the door. See, this show is live. We just do it off the cuff, and it's fun that way. It's fun that way. It took me till I would say it was about 21 before I was able to kind of even put that into perspective. It was just a very strange thing for me. Now, my mom, I don't think she was a deliberately cruel person, and I don't mean to, even put her down. I really think she's trying to figure life out for herself, and she had no clue that this was the impact she was having on me. And I think that's a sad truth for way too many parents. I think it was a sad truth even for me as a young parent, that I'm so struggling with my own sense of meaning in life that I don't realize the impact and the message that I might be sending to my own children. And how my own need to cope and deal with the puzzles of life are just not really working well. On the other side of my parents, there was a dad who was severely critical and very analytical. Now, he was a very calm person, as I remember him. I don't ever recall my father getting angry or flying off the handle or acting like he was about ready to lose it, ever. I never actually ever heard any of my parents use bad language or any of that sort of thing. In many ways, they were civil and appropriate and used correct protocol. But I sometimes would describe my dad as it's like being raised by Captain Spock, somebody who was always analyzing things, had no sense of emotion or even an appreciation for it. And he was also, in many ways, very busy. He was a very productive and successful person, I guess, in many ways. And so he was absent most of the time. But when he was around, I was subject to a great deal of analytical review of exactly what it was that I was doing and how it wasn't really up to snuff. There was a sense in which I felt as though I wouldn't have put it together back back then, I thought, he's God, he's right, he knows everything. He's a good man, and when he's criticizing me, he's just telling me things that are just really true, and evidently I'm really just a lousy excuse of a human being. It's so unfortunate, and I feel so bad that I'm disappointing him so badly. But I guess that's just all I am, and that's the way I was making sense of it as a child, so I wasn't feeling like I was being emotionally abandoned. I just was, and I didn't. Of course, when you're growing up in any home, that's normal for you. You don't necessarily know what goes on in other houses, not necessarily. Or if you do, and it's too difficult to think about, you don't think about it. You dismiss it. In fairness, I'd have to say that, in later years, I think I look back at it, I think my dad was somewhat Asperger's. I don't think he could make the connections. I don't think he realized he couldn't make those connections. Or maybe he really was just an ass. I don't know. I've never been able to figure it out. But he was never, he wasn't physically abusive with me or anything, but he was always constantly pointing out to me ways in which my performance and my behavior lacked the sort of sophistication, professionalism, and efficiency and skill that is really required for something well done. I don't recall any time in my childhood where my father ever had a word of praise for me, ever. I don't recall ever doing anything where he said, "Hey, good job." No memory of anything like that. I don't remember being. I remember he hugged me once. It was after he had a little discussion with me, and I was crying, and I thanked him for talking to me and giving me some help, and it ended with a hug. It's the only hug I remember. There was no closeness, none. And I never thought as a child that this was something that was out of the ordinary. It's all I knew. Another factor that I think that contributed to the development of my own personality was that I was the only boy. I had 5 sisters, but I was the only boy. Well, that's not entirely true. I do have a brother, but that brother wasn't born until I was 13, so he doesn't count. No, by the time I'm 13, my identity as the only boy amongst 5 girls was pretty solid, and he's just a baby. So it was good to have the brother around, but it wasn't as if we were going to get to the point where before I left home, we were going to become buddies or pals or something. Although, as he got older, it was certainly I drifted out of that identity as the only boy. However, by being the only boy, there was a kind of a social distance. My sisters hung out with each other. As far as I'm aware, only one of my sisters ever really experienced my parents in a positive manner. I have one sister who used to say they didn't raise us, they lowered us. And some of them would, they clung to each other and their friends as a way of kind of getting through life. But I was just the loner. And so there was a sense in which that actually provided for me a sense of isolation and what have you. Now, I shared all of this with you, not just to kind of spill my beans and my guts. That's not my point. I began by saying that, we're not changed by what it is we experience. And I want to tell you that as horrible as that experience was for me, as painful as childhood was, growing up in that kind of a situation, and as destructive as it was for me, I finally came to the point where I realized that that's not what hurt me. It wasn't the distance. It wasn't the criticisms. It wasn't the hatred of men. It wasn't the being isolated from all these other people. That's not what really destroyed me. That was uncomfortable. It wasn't fun. And it was certainly created a vacuum in which my thoughts had to find some sort of explanation, of course. But I did come to that point where I realized What really hurt me was what I thought all of that said about me. The failure that I must be, the incapable person that I must be, the person unworthy of say, the love, the person who can't win these things, and so consequently, the pain that I was in came to me in a story that I spun for myself, as it were, that I made sense of all of this to me to where my life became justified. I ended up being in a situation, as it were, that I made sense of, that it was something that was appropriate and worthy of a person of such low inadequacy as myself. And I realized that most clearly when I was about 32. And I had been struggling with various issues and trying to figure this out and trying to become a better person. And, there's a lot of people who are struggling will. And I was talking to a philosophy professor. And he was the one who actually reiterated this back to me when I told him about how angry I was at my father and his constant criticism and how it just destroyed me. And he said, look, I'm not going to tell you that your dad was right in what he did. I'm not going to tell you that that was an environment not well conducive to your well-being. But I do want to tell you something. If you're going to be mad at anybody, you're really going to have to be mad at yourself, because none of that stuff ever hurt you until you thought it said something about you. And when you thought it said something about you, when you validated that, and I'm not blaming you for it, what else would you do? It makes sense. But let's be clear about one thing. When you validated it, you are the one who did all that damage. And, I listened to that argument and I thought, well, it's true. If I had made other conclusions about what that stuff did or didn't say about me, it wouldn't have hurt. And he said, look, here's the good news. The good news is this. You're the one who concluded that it said those things about you. You are also the one who can conclude it doesn't, who can come to a new conclusion, who can re-examine the evidence and be more honest about what it actually says about you. And of course, in doing that, what a different trip that was for me. That was for me the beginning of the end. I was at a point when he had said that to me, I was already at a point where I had asked myself many questions that were never going to get answered in terms of some of the traditions that I had held on to. At the time that had happened, I'd already resigned as pastor of the last church that I'd actually been a senior pastor in. And so I was really already in the process of a lot of the theological dilemmas. But this was one where I began to see that in some ways my fundamentalism was another version of my experience of my mother and my father. A mother who I experienced. I mean, she's dead now, so I can't really talk to her too much about it to clarify whether this is the way she saw it. But, a mother who loves me because I'm her son and yet hates me because I'm becoming a man is not that different from a God who loves me because I'm a creation and hates me because I'm a sinner. The calm father who has this distance from me is not too different from the God who can't get close to people who are sin. It's not too different from the law that condemns us when we see all of the flaws articulated and clearly pointed out for exactly what they are and exactly how inadequate they are to the actual perfectionism that life might demand. There was a sense in which I realized that that my fundamentalism, and by the way, I don't think this is what fundamentalism is to everybody who embraces it, but this is definitely what it was for me. It was, in some sense, a deification of the same experience I had with my parents. And in a sense, I've even seen some parallels in the way that as a pastor, how my relationship with fellow Christians was in some ways isolated. You know, you're the pastor, you're the loner, you're not one of them, you're one of the leadership, and you're almost like a different form of you know, like the bee colonies. They have the worker bees and the drones and the soldiers, and you know, and so yeah, you're the pastor, and so different different manifestation of the species, as it were, and I began to see clearly how a lot of that was really just a reworking of this scenario, even perhaps possibly for me to find a solution to it. But you know, the solution to it actually was coming a lot earlier, because it was inevitable in this sense that I was at a young age when I had actually discovered belief in God, and my original faith wasn't anything close to fundamentalism. I had no idea at that time what fundamentalism was. I was only 7 years old when I was in the basement of this church that my family went to. And we went to this church. We were there every Sunday without fail, except during the summer when my dad owned a large boat, and it was up on the lake, and we would always spend the weekends up on the boat during the boating season, and we'd cruise all over the place. But other than that, we were always in church. And it was this one winter day, I'm about 7 years old, I think, and it's very cold, very bitter winter that year. And we get into the church, and of course, we got what? Seven at that time, 6 kids in the family, 5 sisters, myself, and I was one of the first ones to get the coat off, you know. And we had to get into the church, go down the stairs into a lobby area that was in the basement, and hang up our coats there in this coat room. And there was this warm door there, and I'd go and I'd lean against the door because it was warm. And it was comfortable to do that. And one of my sisters, I believe it was my sister Barb, she said to me, "Do you know why the door is warm?" And no, why is it warm? And her answer to me was, "Because they keep God in there." Now, I'm in a church. I'm only 7. That made sense to me. And I leaned against the door. It was warm. And that winter, I tried to make sure that I was always the first person with his coat off, so that my mom had to hang it up so it didn't drag on the floor. I learned how to kind of push the buttons that way, you know. Get my coat off as I'm going down the stairs, and she, "Oh, I don't want to get around this." My coat would get hung up first, and I'd lean against the door. And that winter, you know, I don't know when it was I first discovered that he ain't in there, but it's a furnace room. I don't know when it was I discovered that, but I spent that winter, as it were, you know, on Sunday mornings, leaning against that door, getting close, as it were, experiencing a sense of God's presence, an awareness that that was a thing to experience. And it was, for me, calming. It was reassuring, and it was inexplicable, but it was also silent. Nothing. Nothing was ever said. Nothing needed to be said. I didn't think of anything to say. My faith in God began with an awareness that he simply is there, and that was okay. And so it was in doing that that was when I first began to find, in that quiet presence, there was no criticism. In that quiet presence, there was no double bind of, you know, "Oh, you're a kid," or "Oh, you're a boy." You know, it was just this warmth that I needed. And that was the beginning of my personal experience of the idea of having faith. And that was something which was in some ways very contrary to the rest of my life, very different from the rest of my life, but it was also very indistinct and inarticulate. Didn't have any concepts really involved with it that were clearly defined. It was just an ongoing presence. And I'm trying to think, what did that tell me? What did that say to me? Well, one of the things that I found that it said to me about myself was that I never died touching the door. I was not forbidden to touch the door. There was no issue at all that I was touching the door. It was a choice that I had made. And it was something that I didn't share with anybody either. I never told anybody. I don't, my sister Barb may have said that statement just as a, in passing and as part of her sense of humor. And I don't think she even remembers having said it. And I don't think anybody has any clue why it is I'm leaning against that door other than, well, it's cold outside and he's trying to get warm. So in some ways, that was also for me a very private experience. Now, I remember as time went on, because I was like 7 years old at the time, by the next winter, I'm sure I'd already discovered it's just a furnace room. But I then had generalized this experience to where I became aware of the fact that if God is there, then he's there. And he's there whether we're near the furnace room door or not. And I haven't heard him say a thing. And I don't know what it is. And I found that for me, sometimes just stopping to recognize that somehow I live in the front of the face of God and just there, just an inarticulate presence, became for me a moment of peace, a way of relaxing, a way of shutting out the rest of the world where all that criticism was. But it was also a world that I perceived as being the other world. It didn't, at that point in time, have any practical application to this world. When it came to this world, you had to do homework and you had to do this, and there were chores in the house and the dishes to do and things like this. And of course, when you're living in a house where there's 5 kids, there's a ton of work to do, and the kids have to be a part of doing it. And the disciplinarian of the house would certainly see to it that that's exactly the way that we did it. But the rest of that experience still maintained that story that I imagined it said about me of how I'm just totally inadequate to life. But I don't think that at that time I was seeing the story that way. I was experiencing in that way. I had those kinds of thoughts, but I don't think that I ever said, I don't feel adequate to life. I don't think that I ever put it into those words until a day when I was 12 or 13, I think it was. And I remember coming home late one night because I was, maybe at a Cub Scout meeting or something. And as I come home, there's this car parked in front of the house. Nice car. It's not my dad's car, not my mom's car. It was a nice car. And then when I get inside the house, I find that one of my older sisters is going out on a date. And this is the guy's car who came over, and they're looking in the paper trying to pick out a movie and all this. And I remember looking back out the window at the car. And I don't know why, but the first thought that occurred to me as I looked back out the window at the car is, that's a nice car. You know what? I'll never own a car like that because I'm a failure. And I'm actually looking at something that I now know will never be in my future. I'm just too much of a failure. And if it takes a car like that to go out on a date, chances are I'll never go out on a date. I probably will never get married. I'm just going to be a lonely person. And I remember thinking that. And to me, it wasn't a traumatic moment. It was merely a moment of clarity. Perhaps following my dad's own personality style. Just a matter of fact, it was just the logical conclusion to draw from the evidence that was in front of me. And but I do remember having that feeling, and that was the first time I think that I recall ever having the sense of what all of this experience that I'm going through, what it says about me, and then finally articulating it in terms of some sort of theme. And that, I think, is part of that story that caused the fundamentalism later to resonate with me. But it wasn't until I was actually a senior in high school that I started reading the Bible. Now, I was raised in an Episcopal church, and although we read the Bible from time to time, we didn't have one in the house that I was aware of, and we only had the reading from the Gospel and the reading from the lesson from the Psalter, and then there was some Old Testament reading every Sunday in church. There'd be some reading from the New Testament, some reading from the Old Testament, but also an additional reading from the Psalms. And so, but I found a Bible. It was in the house. It was my grandmother's Bible, and I started reading it. And this is the first time I realized really all the stuff that was in there. And being a person who had real faith in the idea of God, but I had no idea of what being saved or not being saved, forgiven, not forgiven, sin, not sin. None of that stuff made any sense to me. But anyhow, so I found this Bible, and I began reading it, and I began talking to other people about it, and finding friends who also deal with Bibles and things like that. And next thing I know, I'm finding evangelical and fundamentalist friends. And at the same time, I was contemplating at that time that maybe I should become a minister. I'd like to do that. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is that I remember there was a Sunday I was sitting in church, and I'm sitting back in the pew, and I'm listening to this message being given by, at that time, I believe it was a Reverend George Entwistle. Nice fellow. He's no longer with us. I wish that I had had an opportunity to see him before he passed away. I would have wanted to thank him for many things that I never really got an opportunity to clarify with him. But he was my mentor. And he was helping me as a young man get ready to make this decision. But I remember as a young child, before I began pursuing this concept and before he became my mentor, listening to him one day, and I remember thinking, when I'm listening to the message, this is not relevant. I think God has something to say. I don't know what it is. I have no idea what it is, but I'm pretty sure this isn't it. I'd like to find out what it is, and I'd like to say it. And that was the time when I decided that, I really wanted to be a minister, and I really wanted to have a message, and I didn't have one. And I knew there had to be one, and I knew I hadn't heard it yet. So when I found this Bible at the age of 18, I'm already in the process of the mentoring of my mentor. And he's preparing me to go to a seminary that I would be going to, and I'm getting ready to graduate from high school, old enough to do that, I guess. And then he started going through this personal set of doubts, and he's going through a crisis of faith, my mentor was. And he was, I think, very admirably honest with me about how he was going through that. But my young idealist self was thinking, what? You're a grown man and you're having doubts, and you want me to go to the same kind of a seminary you went to? I don't think so, was my internal reaction. I don't think I said it that way, but I shared some of these ideas with some of my friends who were also reading the Bible, and they told me about this awesome school where I wouldn't have this problem. And that's how I ended up at Bob Jones University. And I loved it at the time. But it's because that was part of that story of the things that it was saying about myself. This part of my history, though, made it inevitable that this would eventually fall apart. I was rejecting my mentor because of the doubts that he was having. I had this young and idealistic, immature concept of how faith ought to work and how mature people deal honestly with real questions. Little did I know that the day would come myself when I would start to have some real questions, and I would understand and perceive George Entwistle in a very, very different way. When at first I considered him as somebody who probably didn't have real faith, I now look back at him and see a man who is admirably honest, and I wished I'd had the opportunity to express my appreciation to him before he died. I'll get a chance to do that again someday. Anyhow, all of this contributes to the story that I'm telling myself about myself and the way that I'm using my faith as a way of sustaining and maintaining that story. You know, I discovered also the guitar at a pretty young age. And one of the things I discovered about the guitar is that it was easy to get lost in it. It was easy to just forget about everything. And I liked the guitar. And I didn't know if I was very good at it, but I liked it so much that I didn't want anything to ruin it. And I deliberately would practice my guitar when my dad was around. I didn't want him to hear me play. I didn't want him to interfere with it. And I don't know that my dad, he's now dead, I don't know that he ever really heard me play much at all. And I don't think I ever really pursued it that much at all. That was a part of my life. I didn't want the people who made me feel uncomfortable have anything to do with. And so that was a gift that I pursued, an ability that I pursued, and I allowed it to develop in a very different way. My first guitar broke. I was so sad at that. I stepped on it. And I guess I was like 8 or 9. I got it when I was 7, somewhere around there. I can't remember. But I remember I stepped on it, and it broke. And from then on, I had to just borrow a friend's guitars if I was going to play them until finally, when I was around 12, I managed to get a hold of a Gretsch Corsair, and it was mine, a nice Gretsch guitar. Now, during this time, in this process, I'm trying to make sense of all these things in my life, and I'm not realizing it, but I am creating a conundrum. I am developing a sense of myself that is very inadequate. And I'm developing a sense of God where that inadequacy it's totally irrelevant to him. And then I go through this process of the crisis of faith of my mentor, and I then immediately begin to embrace a faith, a religion, and a preparation for my future that embraces a religion that is as contaminated as the story I had been spinning about myself based on my childhood experience. And these two are about, destined to finally come undone. First of all, I was so deplorably inadequate in the way that I felt about myself that there was going to come a day when I would no longer be able to truly function very well. And there was actually a lot of difficulty. By the time I was, say, in 11th grade, I was so exhausted all the time. I was starting to faint in school regularly. I was very insomniac, full of anxiety, and no sense of personal peace in that sense concerning myself or my life. And when I finally got to college, it got so bad that I was finally forced to drop out because of ill health. And I didn't know what to make of it all, but I felt extremely inadequate. The stories of what was happening, the inability to continue on with college, the struggle that life was, the junk jobs that I was able to find, and the good jobs that I couldn't get. These were all part of contributing to that story. Eventually, I managed to work it through anyway, where I attached myself to various other people, went through different programs, and eventually ended up really pursuing a career in the ministry, but without a formal degree. And then one day, I was sitting down on a couch and thinking about myself. And I was really very disappointed. I realized that my life wasn't anything as magical or as wonderful as I was promising other people Christianity would turn it into. And if I was going to be honest, I looked around me and I saw the Christians that I knew around me struggling with scandal, difficulty, temptations, lives that were far from honest. And I saw other people around me who weren't Christians who were living in what appeared to me to be healthy, normative lives. And this was a serious contradiction. And I felt that maybe what it is, we just need revival. We need a powerful dose of the Spirit of God. And so I thought, what would this take? And I realized that I was such a disgusting person to myself that as I thought about it, um, I went through such a moment of self-loathing that I fell to my knees and I prayed and I asked God to just kill me, just take me. I was too disgusting to be of any value to him or any value to anybody else or any value as a pastor. I saw myself as just a total and utter and complete failure. And I think probably one of the most intense prayers I ever gave in my life. But as a result of that, though, suddenly I had this weird experience. And it was like a near-death experience. I was no longer in my body. It was as if I was somehow back at that real furnace door. There was just this presence. And I was loved. And that didn't make any sense to me. I was loved. No explanation, no story, not even any really words of assurance. And I'm not going to go through all the details. Some of it is on my blog. I don't talk about this that often. But I came out of that moment. Total contradiction to all my theology. But this was the final nail, I would say, in the coffin of what was going to guarantee that I started down this other road. I found that it took me about 6 or 7 years of working that through, but the sense that I was lovable was a whole new experience to me. But it was such a powerful experience to me that there's one thing that did happen that day. I could no longer speak of myself critically. I couldn't do it. I was gracious to myself. I found that I was not just unique. I had to be more gracious to other people about them. It just didn't make sense to me anymore. But of course, I'm trying to do this from the context of still being a fundamentalist. And let me tell you, it didn't work. Eventually, it fell apart. So it wasn't just the intellectual and academic problems that I had with the theology. It wasn't just that, when I finally started studying linguistics and I began to see the difficulty in the history of the Greek New Testament, it isn't that my decision to go down an unconventional road was the result of my studies. There is a real sense in which my need to go down that unconventional road was a story of personal redemption, where I learned to say different things about myself, where I learned to take a different interpretation of what my history says to me about me, where I could be really honest about that, where I could be kind, where I could be gracious, where I could give myself space to grow, space to be human, space to be who I am, space to be a person who struggled, space to be a person who comes from the background I came from. And it built an entirely different me. And by the time it had built an entirely different me, and it took a number of years of struggling with this and thinking it through, I found that religion that was really in some ways a reliving of my childhood experience of my parents, it just didn't fit. It didn't meet my need. It didn't love me. It had no respect for me. It had no respect for anybody. And it had to go. And it did. And I would say that has taught me that, like I said at the beginning, neither you nor I are changed by the things that we experience. What changes us is the sense we make of what happened to us and what we think it says about us. What does that tell me about how do I help others understand how incredibly loved they are by God? It comes by helping them to see also what that says about them. That can be a lifetime exploring that. Well, that's about all the time we have in sharing with you some of these things that in my own development in life that headed me down that unconventional path. Thank you for listening. Enjoyed the opportunity to share, and I'll see you on Sunday. Until then, Take care. This is Bob Graves, the Unconventional Pastor.